Okay, cool. All right, so watercolor. I probably shouldn't hit the table. It's wobbling the camera. Okay, so here we go. So what I did was this. I just grabbed from our previous project. I went through and kind of the game that we played, right, was kind of deciding on what paper you wanted to choose with your watercolor picture. Now again, for the next two watercolor projects we have lined up, I've already got watercolor paper ready to go. Watercolor paper is significantly thicker. You can also get it in what's called hot or cold pressed, right? Hot pressed would be like smooth, right? Cold pressed is kind of lumpity, right? And you might have seen, if you ever go out to like an art store, Michael's or Jerry's Artorama or whatever, if you ever go to an art store, you might see like really high-end watercolor paper that's cold pressed to the point where like it almost looks like a really thin sponge. Like it's like kind of like cardboard thick and like legit like lumpy. People like that. It gives you a really cool technique, a really cool kind of look to your watercolor, because as you're, painting along, almost like a sponge, the water kind of sits and absorbs in different ways, and it gives you a really cool kind of crackle to your artwork that a flat piece of paper just doesn't. So just know the difference whenever you're buying your own paper, if you like watercolor, to know that there is a difference between hot and cold pressed. And again, that has to do with how the paper's kind of made whenever it's squashed out. So for the sake of this demo, I'm going to try and go as quickly as I possibly can because I don't want to bore you guys. But what I do is I just grab 3 different types of paper, and this is stuff we talked about before, right? Here's plain old printer paper, and you can hear, right, it's kind of thin sounding. This is like 20-pound paper, right? Then we go up a little bit, and this one here, right, a little bit thicker sounding. Right? This is like a 40 or 50-pound paper. You can also tell it's kind of a little bit see-through, right? Just like printer paper, you can, trace with it. And then you get up to here, right? And you can kind of hear, sounds like thunder. Then we get up to here. This is more like 80-pound paper. Personally, I wouldn't suggest painting on anything that isn't like 80 or 90-pound and up. Really, these two, you can paint on them, but printer paper especially will just dissolve, just flat out dissolve. And I'm gonna do that for you. Oh, totally. It's just not, it's great for taking math notes on. It's horrible for basically everything else. It is super dirt cheap on purpose. So I also got a whole kind of wide array of different paintbrushes going on here. I've got my little painty water cup going on, and I've got 2 different palettes of paint. Not that you need that, I just want to show you that there's no real difference between what we have going on. I also went ahead and grabbed a quick little tiny kind of flat palette and then one with little trays. I did go out to the store and buy a whole bunch of new palettes. They're sitting off in the corner and they have little trays kind of set up in them. Personally, especially for watercolor, I'd highly suggest using these guys or again, anyone with little kind of trays in it. It lets you kind of mix very evenly without your colors blending, and I'll show you why in a second. Okay, so here we go. I'm just gonna go, like I said, as quick as possible. I'm gonna paint in my direction, so I apologize if you're looking at it upside down, but truly feel free to walk around the room if you can't get the right angle. You're not gonna hurt my feelings. All right, so watercolor, right? We talked before about how watercolor works. It's basically just pigment bound with gum arabic, right? And gum arabic is kind of a chemical mixture, think like gum itself, but it gives you this nice kind of hardened kind of consistency. What's nice is the solvent in this case is water, right? Water is actually dissolving the gum arabic, right? And so, for example, if I wanted to make I'm going to mix up some like fuchsia. It's kind of a fun color. So I'm just adding some water, just kind of dipping and bloop, 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 swirling it around. And I'm just kind of liquefying this. And what's happening is the gum arabic is slowly dissolving and releasing. And all that's happening is the water molecules are grabbing onto the pigment and carrying it around, right? So whenever you think about paint, try your best not to think about like, oh, this is a liquid, colored, fuchsia. Instead, try to chemically understand what's actually happening. I'm just transferring pigment. That's all I'm really doing, right? I'm taking the granules of pigment, microscopic, in this water, right? And I'm just transferring them over to this little tray that I've got, right? Or paper or whatever. That's all I'm doing. I'm transferring, right? So with watercolor, and you might know this stuff already. Again, some of it's pretty basic. I'm gonna make 3 little piles here real quick. With watercolor, the way it works is the intensity of the color, right? The intensity of the color comes from how much pigment is there, right? So you might be tempted, you see both of these trays have a little white kind of container. You might be tempted to use that to lighten your color, and it will work, but not how you think it'll work. If you want a lighter color, you just add more water. That's it. Right? So think about it this way, like I said, it's a chemical ratio. Think about this more like chemistry, less like art class, right? So the more water I put, this ratio, right? The more water I put, the more transparent and the less pigment is in it, right? The more pigment I put and the less water, the darker it becomes, right? That's kind of just obvious kind of logic, right? So if I kind of mix up, I'm gonna take a whole bunch of pigment, I'm really like grinding it in here. So there's a whole bunch of pigment in this little tray down in the bottom. There's a little bit of pigment and a whole lot of water in this top tray. A whole lot of water. Just shoveling this stuff in. Okay, and this is obviously just normal tap water. There's nothing fancy about it. Now what's cool is eventually we can get to the point where we kind of start to experiment with what other liquids can dissolve that gum arabic, right? What if I use rubbing alcohol, or I don't know, what else is a liquid? Gasoline, I don't know, you like go crazy, right? I mean, like, what happens, right? There's a tendency in art where like you're supposed to do it a certain way, and that's baloney, man. The coolest stuff happens whenever you're just like, all right, well, I don't have any water, but I got like a Coca-Cola. Will that work? And just see what happens. Like, why not, you know? I actually used to have a project, we won't do it in this class, but I used to have a project where we went through and we did a watercolor painting, but we only used coffee and tea. And that was it. That was you were allowed to have more like potent tea or potent coffee or more watered down, and you had to paint with that. It was kind of neat. Okay, so, So I've got 3 different kind of values. Just kind of show you right here. And you see one is obviously more liquidy than the other one. You can see it just kind of rolling around there, right? Cool, good, beautiful, okay. So they're all the same color. I just pulled right out of the little cake right there for that fuchsia. So just for the sake of experimentation here, because I like to experiment, let's see, I'm gonna take 3 completely different paintbrushes so there's no mistaking that like, oh, well, one has more pigment than the other. Okay, they're completely clean, 3 completely different paintbrushes, okay? So I'm gonna do this. All right, column A, this is the really, really watered down one. Just gonna pick some up, let it kind of absorb into the paintbrushes, or the bristles, excuse me, and I'm gonna paint, right? And there you go, really, really watered down, okay? And you can even, more water will make it even lighter, right? Okay, paintbrush numero dos, again, clean and make sure. This is my middle tray, so this is kind of like half and half water, half pigment. Just like so. Right. Oops. And again, you can kind of tell a little bit darker, a little bit more kind of consistent, right? Cool. Cool. And then no surprise here, we'll go down to the guy that's basically all pigment, and you can imagine what that's gonna look like. Right? Easy peasy. Okay. So whenever you're painting with watercolor, rule or trick number 1 is just understand that to lighten something is to add water to it, right? Water is, in this case, your white paint, right? Okay, so also, just as a fun note, trays like this kind of suck a duck for painting with watercolor, simply because this happens, right? And then which one was the light one again? Like, yeah, I don't know either, right? Trays or little tiny trays kind of contain your paint. You don't want that to happen, that's no good. So, don't use those. Okay, so let's go ahead next. All right, so my next idea, right, is the idea that I want to go through and think about how watercolor, how just good craftsmanship kicks in, right, how it works. There's a tendency to, especially even like this here, I mean, there's a wide variety of colors that, you know, Crayola has given me, right? But in my personal and professional opinion, skip over, man. Like, screw you, Crayola. You don't have to tell me, right? Make your own colors. Don't use these things. They're stupid, right? Instead, check this out, right? You can mix in the tray. Obviously, these lids up here are really kind of messy, and that's fine. But I'm going to make my own colors, right? So I'm going to say, give me, what's a color? Just give me blue. Okay, it's blue-green. Done. Okay. So there we go. I'm going to add some water, do a little bit of green. Now, there is, in this big palette over here, there's already kind of a blue-green. It already exists. But I don't really like Crayola. They're a bunch of jerks. So, you know what? I'm making my own. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of add some green. Here's some light green. See what that does. Really, excuse me. Really, it's almost like you're a chemist of color. A colorist. That's stupid. It's first period, guys. I'm trying to keep myself entertained. I'm sorry. So I'm just kind of, you can see I'm literally just shoveling. I'm kind of swirling around and shoveling this paint into my little tray. And I'm kind of making my own blue-green. Because that's what I want to do, right? I'm just making it my own. And I promise you, it will look more creative, just better in general, that you're making your own colors. Don't pull right out of the tube. They're very bland and very dry. You want to make your own, I promise. Okay, give me another color, fellas.
Red.
Red and orange. Okay, so we're making a red orange. And again, there's one already here, but that's kind of stupid. Let's make our own. So I'm just gonna add some water. And again, remember, the water takes a second or two because it is chemically dissolving the gum arabic. So don't expect like you put a little bit and it just magically works. Again, be really cautious of just dragging right onto the paper. It just looks boring. It's dull. Make it your own. It's gonna look way cooler and you're gonna like it a lot more, I promise. You have complete control over what you choose to make. So whenever you're mixing your own colors or whenever you're just, painting in general, remember to go along and this is your picture, right? This is your painting. Think about again, kind of chemistry, right? So if I'm making a red-orange, I know that red is darker than orange, obviously, right? So if I put equal parts red and orange, the red is going to overpower that orange. It's just more potent, right? It would be like if I'm making a meal at home and I need to add a pinch of salt, right, and a handful of pepper. It's too much. It's just overpowering, right? So you want to think about as you're mixing your paints, kind of chemically in your brain, think, okay, well, maybe I need a little bit extra of this kind of lighter orange to make my red-orange really how I want it to look. So again, think about that kind of potency. Okay, so I've got the little Irish flag over here. I've got my kind of orange, I've got my kind of green, and I've got my white tray. All right, so a big problem that people tend to run into when it comes to painting, if you have no experience painting, and I mean zippo, right? If that's the case, a lot of times I have students that try to paint like they're drawing, right? What I mean by that is this. I'm going to just really quickly mess up, but I'm going to go ahead and let's say I'm going to take some of my green here. And let's say I want to paint a beautiful portrait. I'm going to paint a self-portrait, which is really easy because I'm painfully bald. So I'm just going to go ahead and I start, like I would if I was drawing, right? Okay, well, here's this, okay. Giving myself a little shine. Oh, okay, that looks nice. And here's my sort of pretty accurate eyeballs. And there's about the size of my nose. I do have those weird little mole things there. I'm not sure what those are for. And my jaw kind of comes down. I've got a nice little Adam's apple down here. And I guess I smile occasionally. All right, so that looks, that is a pretty, not gonna lie guys, that is a pretty accurate looking self-portrait. I would say that is pretty much on point right there, right? When I'm, but it's good, right? It's just good. Okay, so the problem that a lot of times, and that's obviously horrible. The problem is a lot of times, whenever people paint for the very first time, like I said, they try to paint like they're drawing. So they stick with outlines, right? And then they say, oh, well, okay, if I was drawing, I'd get my outlines on there. Then I go back, I'm a smart person, and I would add some shadow, right? Now again, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But what happens is it starts to the outline almost contains the picture, right? It kind of blocks it in and keeps it kind of chunkified, and it just kind of doesn't work all that well. It just doesn't do what you want to do. And then it's really hard to gauge how much shadow is too much shadow, right? And pretty soon your picture is just completely overrun and just you've lost the picture. It's just gone, right? Again, not a horrible travesty, but definitely not what I was hoping for, right? Cool. Also think about too, again, the quality of paper, right? How much water, literally old drippy water, how much water I put on this thing matters. This is really cruddy 20-pound paper, right? So if I'm just gonna literally take some paint right out of the tube here. Right, okay, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, I've used 3 now, 3 little painties here, 4, and I have basically I have completely destroyed, within 4 paint strokes, I've destroyed this paper. Yeah, that's horrible, right? So, be really careful. It's not so much how much pigment, it's how much water, right? Water is dissolving the paper, right? So with that being said, what you need to think about is, how can I dry in between my layers? Does that make sense? So here we go. Okay, so, it's gone. Okay. It never happened, never existed. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears. Sticking with my same kind of color palette, I've mixed it up myself, I'm going to go with that. But I'm going to do something slightly different, okay? I'm going to go ahead and start with a bigger brush. And it doesn't mean you have to, by any means. I just want to show you that you don't need to be constrained by these small little tiny paint brushes. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to take some plain water. Now my water is a little bit tinted because of that kind of fuchsia color that was there a little bit ago. I'll actually take a little bit of that fuchsia because why not? And all I need, I'm just going to do a little smidgen up here, you can see, like it's there. I mean, it's kind of there. I mean, it's wet looking, right? But really, other than you and I, you know in about 13 seconds, that's just going to evaporate. I mean, it's barely even there, right? So I'm going to paint my picture using this basically just kind of water and maybe a tint, just a hint of some color. Doesn't really matter what it is, because again, it's going to get painted over, who cares? And I'm going to use this to kind of almost paint a sketch, right? Not really outlining. And again, it's kind of just for me, so I can kind of visualize my picture. And again, if you can't quite see it, that's totally okay. I'm going to go a little bit darker than normal, just so that you can kind of tell what's going on. So I'm just going to kind of get this on here enough that I can say, okay, well, there's the nose and there's the face. And again, I'm just kind of playing, not really overthinking it, because again, all this is going to evaporate in like 13 seconds. Who cares, right? It's all about just kind of getting something. And I'm not outlining, right? I'm just kind of placing almost shadowy shapes, right? Whenever we were drawing anatomy, we went through and literally added, like blended with the charcoal, these big blocks of shadow, right? We started thinking in shapes, less so in lines, in outlines. And that really is going to be the thing that is your saving grace. If you can think more in shapes and shadows, that's going to be the thing that really helps. Okay, so I've got my picture on here. Again, I don't even know if you guys can see anything on there right now, but it's enough that I can kind of see there's a face kind of in there, right? Just enough, right? Okay, so, all right. Now, personally, I like to wait in between my layers. That's me personally. There are plenty of people that like to do a technique called wet on wet, where I wet the paper first or apply a wet layer of paint and then immediately keep going through, almost like a plein air, where you're just painting in the moment, outside or something. Where you're letting the paint purposely kind of blend and bleed and swirl together. Personally, I like more control over that. No surprise, you guys to see my artwork, it's more controlled. But I'm going to try and paint as generically as I can to make sure that you guys feel good. The missing component here is it's always good to have a little paper towel nearby. Some people like to go through and actually like press to try and absorb the paint. The downfall or the water. The downfall, of course, is that you can also pick up pigment as well and can lighten your picture. Or you can take a little crinkly piece of paper. This is a printmaking technique. Kind of flatten it because you don't want any crinkles or wrinkles on there, or else they'll drag like it's a big paintbrush, basically, right? Kind of flatten it down, and you can kind of press and roll. You never want to drag if you're trying to dry your paint, because again, you're just pulling it like a paintbrush or something. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to think about my colors here. I'm going to mix up ahead of time. I still want to stick with this kind of bluey green, but I'm going to mix up some different values. So what if I had one that was way more blue, but maybe a little more transparent, so more water, right? And what if I had one that was like way more green, and we'll say it's super green, so I'm just using a lot of pigment in that one. I'm going to mix in my green, so I make my own. Because again, who likes Crayola? Nobody. Bunch of jerks. They're not jerks. They're fine. They're good people. Maybe they're not. I don't know. All right, so then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. So notice I'm mixing my palette ahead of time. Instead of mixing as I paint, right? How boring would that be? I'm mixing kind of ahead of time, and that really allows me to not stress or worry. Like, I'm already thinking ahead, like, okay, I'm going to need this color. I better have it ready to go, right? So again, some are more watered down. Some are more kind of pigment deep, ready to go. Okay, cool. That's good enough for me. All right, so, excuse me. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna start with the lightest value that I possibly can, the one that is super watery and grody. And personally, I like to start with my shadows. That's me. You could also totally go kind of light to dark. You could go dark to light. It probably makes more sense, especially if you're starting, to go light to dark, so I guess I should take my own medicine and do just that. So I'll go light to dark instead. All right, so I'm going to imagine the shadows coming from this direction of my picture. So I'm just going to start kind of laying down anywhere that I want this watercolor to be for my highlights. And again, it's pretty watered down, like it's, no pun intended. It's pretty transparent, it's pretty soft, right? And I'm just putting it kind of anywhere like a shape, anywhere that I think like, oh, that should have some highlight on it. And again, especially with doing anatomy recently, that'll help whenever we're drawing people as well. Okay. And again, just kind of throwing it on there. Okay. So just for the sake of argument, right? Shapes of color, right? I'm not outlining, I'm doing shapes of color. Cool? Cool, okay. I'm just gonna keep increasing as I go along here. So next up, we'll do kind of the darker, kind of red-orange that we got going on. And right now I'm doing wet on wet, which means that I can actually blend my colors right on my piece of paper. You do want to be careful about how much water you're using, because again, it'll eat through the paper, and that is no bueno. But what's nice is with watercolor, it can kind of bleed together, which is something that other paints don't really have the ability to do. So that's something that's pretty neat. Okay. What's cool too is if for some reason I mess up, right? If that happens, you can do a couple things. One, you can kind of quickly try to kind of almost erase it with a paper towel. That works. You can take a little bit of clean water, just clean water, and again, just a little bit, and kind of apply it, and then kind of pat it down and dry it. It'll never totally go away, but you can get rid of kind of a mistake. If you get rid of it pretty quickly, it'll disappear pretty quickly. Enough that no one will care. Okay, keep on keeping on, just going as quick as I possibly can. Let's get some more kind of darker color. So this is a pretty dark kind of orangey red going on here. And that's cool. Now, for me personally, as I'm painting this, I'm like, you know, this is getting a little bit too, I don't know what the word is, chunky looking. It's a little bit too bold for my personal taste. So what's nice about watercolor is, again, it's a pigment, right? I can actually reactivate the pigment just by adding a little bit of water to it. So for example, like his nose, he's kind of got like a Hitler stash thing going on right now. That's probably not the best idea. Like, no, you don't really want a Hitler stash in your picture. Unless, of course, you're painting Hitler, and then I guess that's a good thing. So instead, look at this. I'm just going to take the smallest amount, just regular water, and again, I probably want clean water at this point, but it's a demo. And I'm just going to literally paint with water. That's what I'm doing, just painting with water. And that paint will allow me to reactivate and soften those edges, just like so. Right? Just soften those edges. And I can take my watercolor and kind of blend it out. Now again, there's still that same amount of pigment on the picture. That pigment's still there. I can't, you know, really pick it up short of using like a sponge or a paper towel or something. But I can push it around so that it's not so obvious. So now Hitler stash is gone. Right? Cool. So a little bit of water, right? And you can kind of reactivate those pigments. Okay? Okay. There's that. So I'm going to switch gears and jump over into the kind of green-blue real quick, get my kind of shadowy side going on. And again, I'm going to start with my lightest value, right? Kind of bring it right up. I'm going to let those colors kind of swirl. They'll maybe make like a little bit of like a light brownish colors. They mix and match, and that's okay. That can look pretty cool. So I'm just going to kind of grab that. Again, I'm getting a little too heavy with my water. Be really careful with how much water you apply. That can mess a good picture up really quickly. And the watercolor paper that we're using is also, like I said, much thicker, so it shouldn't be as much of a problem. Okay. And I do want to apologize, or I want to thank you guys very much for kind of listening. I know these kind of demos can be a little bit dry sometimes, but hopefully you're getting something out of it. Okay. So that feels a little bit wet to me. I'm just going to take a second. I'm going to blot my paper, and all I'm going to do, you can tell here, right? I'm going to take a paper towel, nice and flat, right? Just going to lay it gingerly on top and just press very lightly. I'm not really pressing all that hard. And you'll see, even then, I picked up a good bit of that green paint, right? I lost some of it. That's okay, right? But keep in mind, if you do try to, like if I'm getting too much water on the paper, I might have to go back and kind of touch it up later on, putting a little bit more pigment in there. Okay. I'm going to get a little bit darker, kind of my bluey color here that I got going on. Maybe get some more pigment in there. That's not as dark as I was hoping. Don't be afraid to have a little piece of like scratch paper, even just printer paper is fine, just to kind of test your color. Sometimes that really helps to be able to kind of look at it before you actually start painting. You'd hate to be, I hate for you guys to start painting and then, kind of be surprised by the color that you're applying. So again, you can tell how I'm kind of painting with shapes, right? I'm not really outlining, painting with shapes of color, right? If you guys have had a digital design class with me or any other time, you might have done like a vector project. Have you guys done vectors with me? Is anyone in digital? No, kind of, sort of. If in the computer, there's a program called Adobe Illustrator, and Adobe Illustrator is used for illustrations. But what's nice about it is you can do a thing called a vector, and vectoring is pretty cool because it's basically this process. You're making these kind of shapes, but what's cool about them is that they never ever get pixelated. So if you've ever taken like a photo with some friends or something, and then all of a sudden that selfie gets like pixeled or kind of gross looking, vectoring your art is a really good way of solving that problem. Okay, so now I'm just kind of going along here, getting in there. I'm not going to worry about doing hyper kind of details because again, it's a demo. We don't need any of that jazz. So at this point, kind of starting to look like something, right? Not an amazing piece of art, but again, I mean, there's a face in there, right? Me personally, I still really want to blend some of those colors. It's just kind of annoying to me. So again, I'm just going to take a little bit of water and just right along the edge, kind of soften. And again, that's the best part about watercolor is I can always reactivate it with a little bit of water, and I can soften those edges. Sometimes you want a harsh edge, like his nose should be really harsh because it's standing out, right? There's a cast shadow. But like his eyes, maybe not as harsh as I have them. And in case I'm squeezing the brush just to kind of dry it as I got a lot of water in my brush. So again, not the world's greatest picture, but I think for a 10-minute demo, not too shabby. Okay, so shapes. Good, cool. We're thinking in shapes, we're painting in shapes, we're not painting in outlines. And again, just think about the last drawing I did, like those little outline drawing. It looks cartoony, it looks flat, right? Shapes are better. Okay, you got it in here for one more go around? You okay? You all right with me? I know, I don't roll your eyes. You jerk. Oh, okay. All right, here we go. We're gonna go super quick now. So your first project, like I said, I'm gonna have 2 watercolor projects, okay? I'm gonna introduce the second one to you next class, but your first watercolor project that we're gonna do is going to be anything revolving around architecture, okay? Buildings of any sort. Now you can go, I'm gonna show you some examples in a little bit. You can go hyper detailed, you can go really generic. You wanna do just a big skyscraper that's basically a cube floating in the sky? I'm cool with that, right? But what I wanna do is this. I want you to think about how you can kind of present your composition. So I'm gonna show you an example. What popped in my head was the Capitol. I recently went to Houston, and a lady friend and I walked around the Capitol, or not Houston, excuse me, Austin. Walked around the Capitol of Texas in Austin. And the Capitol in Texas looks a lot like the national Capitol. You can imagine like the Capitol building with that big dome on top, right? You know, like from history class, right? That big dome. And for some reason, the idea just popped in my head this morning, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and draw, and again, very lightly with my pencil. I'm gonna go ahead and draw just kind of this dome, right? Just something domular. Okay, it's got like a little steeple or something going on up top there. Excuse me. Steeple? Domular? Yes, domular is probably not a word I would use in any other room other than this room. I would probably lose some of my way cool art person credentials, which they give you whenever you graduate college. So they give you a little sheet with how many credentials you have, and they say, you know, you can lose these, be careful. All right, so there's my kind of domular thing, right? Just kind of peeking through, right? And in my imagination, right? Or maybe you find a photo or something online. In my imagination, I kind of see it poking through like treetops, right? But I won't lie, I don't really want to paint trees, like stupid trunks and stuff and branches. Oh my God. So I'm just going to cheat because, well, why not? I'm just going to paint like some squiggles here. We'll say like it's kind of peeking through the treetops. Maybe there's some trees behind it, right? There's a sense of depth, right? Okay, something like that. Maybe like, they're very high trees, yes. It's a post-apocalyptic picture. Trees have now grown around the dome, taking over society. There are tree people that have now eaten most of mankind. This is my picture, my devotion to the tree people that will take over the world. Okay, so, yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so I've got my little treetops, right? Kind of my treetops, I've got some in the background, I've got a little sunshine. So I'm gonna go hyper quick now and try my best to stop talking so much. All right, so whenever you're painting, any kind of painting, it is a really good tactic to get into, working from the background to the foreground, right? Background to foreground. So here we go. Again, I'm going to go as quick as possible. I'm going to start with my big paintbrush, just because I can go quicker. I'm not going to worry about a sky so much, because again, it's a demo, and I'm sure I'm boring you guys too much. In the world, in the real world, whenever you're in the world, not the fake world, whenever you look off way in the distance, and I mean like way in the distance, things tend to get a little bit more blue. That's called atmospheric perspective or atmospheric projection. When that happens, right, be aware of, like, if I'm painting something in the background, it's going to be a little bit bluer. Not a lot, mind you, not a lot, but just a hint bluer, and that's going to really make it feel like it's further away in space. So whenever you're painting something, make sure to think about atmospheric perspective or projection. Probably not so much blue, probably more of an orangey red, but yeah, I mean the same concept applies of things are going to get kind of duller and a little bit of a different tint as they go further back. And you are more than welcome to do something on Mars. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of paint these kind of bluish trees in the background, kind of avoiding my capital dome. So again, ta-da-da-da-da, ta-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Cool. Background. Totally don't be afraid to like mix and match, maybe put some more. I'm going to do this here just for the heck of it. I'm going to do some like two-tone going on, right? So what if I do, and this is really dark. Why not? Let it be a little crinkly, little tree-like, right? And I'm just going to take some water real quick, wet on wet. I'm just going to kind of blend these out. So now I've got a little bit of like some shadow kind of going on into my trees. So it's not just flat looking, right? That would be kind of dull and boring. Kind of sinks into the background a little bit, right? Kind of sinks in there. Cool. Cool. Okay. All right, next up. The next thing in the background here, we're working our background to our foreground, would be our dome. Let's see, what do I got? I'm going to mix up some colors here real quick. I'm just going to make it kind of a bluish color. I'm going to really lighten it, though. Like a really super light blue. Okay, some water. Perfect. And, yeah, okay. All right, so here we go. And I'm going to say my light is coming from this direction, so I'm going to start on the darker side. And again, this is probably not going to be the most detailed dome in the world, but it won't be the worst by any means. Okay. Just like so. Now, I want to do a little bit more of that kind of two-toning where I say, okay, I want to kind of showcase some of my light. Notice how where it's really, really bright, I want to leave it alone, right? The white paper is the highlight, right? I don't need to paint light. I can just let this happen. So I'm going to get a little bit of a darker kind of bluish. We'll give it kind of a shadow. And again, you want to do probably a little better than I'm doing, but not too shabby. And again, just for the sake of argument, a little wet on wet. Just apply a little bit of water just to soften some of these edges a little bit. Your hands probably will get painty. It's not a bad thing. Cool. All right, let's get down here. Almost kind of looks a little monochrome right now. I probably should have a better palette to start with, but good enough. Dome. Cool. Okay. Final note. Let's kind of get into the trees here. I'm going to go crazy for a second. I'm just going to use a gnarly big old brush because why not? We're doing a demo. None of this really matters. A little bit of water. Just getting all sorts of colors going on. I feel like Bob Ross. Happy trees. Look at this. Oh, look at that happy tree. God, that's a happy tree. It's still on spring break. That's why it's so happy. Okay. Oh, beautiful. A little bit of blue, maybe. Again, make your own green. Don't just steal right out of the tube. That's dull and boring. Right? Make your own. Make your own. Okay. So that looks kind of cool. But again, I'm left with a problem, kind of a dilemma here that like, all right, so my picture, it's a dome coming out of some treetops, right? But it's really stagnant. Like the composition isn't great because it kind of just stops, right? So whenever I get this stoppage going on, I'm just gonna go ahead and mix it up. What if I used a fan brush? Again, not really a correct way of doing this. Fan brush. What if I just use a little bit of water just to soften and kind of let it fade out, right? I'm letting the water, let the water kind of fade out a little bit. That fan brush might give me some cool texture, which would look cool with that tree. And again, like I said before, I want to thank you guys for kind of, being super chill at this demo. I know it's kind of a long one, but there's a lot to talk about. Okay, so we got this, and now it kind of fades out just a little bit, makes it look a little bit less contained, a little bit less controlled, kind of just a little bit more whimsical, if you want to think about it that way, a little softer, right? Again, let's be honest, right? Not the world's greatest picture, watercolors ever, right? And yet, much more painterly than, say, like a normal drawing or something like that, right? So, take a breath. Okay, good, right? Take a second, if you would, go ahead back to your chairs. I'm going to introduce our next project. Thanks, guys.